My name's Katy Hogan, and we're sitting in the front patio of the outdoor cafe of the Heartland Cafe in Chicago's wonderful Rogers Park neighborhood. I started this place, it'll be 40 years next year since it opened in 1976. I am now owner emeritus. We sold most of it about 3 years ago to a new majority owner, Tom Rosenfeld, so I'm looking for work. To anybody watching this, I'm looking for work. My cousin asked me to talk about my experiences growing up in the shadow of and deeply involved in the tumult around the Vietnam War, which I'm happy to do. I was a junior in high school on the south side at Queen of Peace High School when I remember the conversion that happened to me. I remember in the fall of my junior year, there were a couple speakers who came to one of the social science classes that I only heard about. I did not hear their presentation, but it was clear from what I heard about them that they were speaking against the Vietnam War, which caused some amount of discussion, consternation, rumor mongering, and other sorts of upset. Proof of that was my not even having heard their presentation, but still being goaded by my homeroom nun, Sister Elizabeth Mary, when I said, "What about the other side?" as my dad would have taught me to do. And she said, "Well, maybe we should find out about the other side." So I went to that social science teacher, a nun who was a very savvy political person, as I recall, and asked her, "What about the other side?" And she said, she did a teacherly thing and said, "I'm interested in knowing where you would find the other side to what these gentlemen said." And then, of course, because she knew I hadn't heard them, she probably didn't put a lot of stock in what I said. But what really hit me was what a fellow student, who wasn't even as political as I was at the time, said, which was, "Why are people getting so excited about this? These guys are college students. They're facing the draft. They have to look at this war." She said it in such a way that it just stopped me in my tracks. And I started studying what the war was about. And I began to realize it was not, it doesn't appear to be what people were saying it was. And the domino theory, basing our foreign policy on fear of communism, was beginning to look to me as not the brightest bulb in the book as far as foreign policy goes. So I think my first anti-war demonstration was in 1967 in Civic Center, now called Daley Plaza. And I'll tell you honestly, I was scared. I was scared of the people I was with. They were very different from my South Side-ness, little young innocent Catholic girl. There were, guys with bandanas and guys with Vietnamese flags and people looking like they were looking for trouble. But there were also a lot of other people there, religious task force folks who have always been in the vanguard of pacifism and peace groups, the Women's for Peace Coalition, American Friends Service Committee. I got to know an awful lot of really good people who were on religious grounds, on political grounds, on just common sense grounds, were mounting to me what made sense as good arguments against us being there. I had been raised in the aftermath of World War II. I loved John Wayne, lapped it up. There was something extremely appealing, and always has been, about the strong, individualist, American West, we can tame this stuff image. Unfortunately, I was compelled to look further. And, what we did in the American West 200 years ago is nothing to be proud of. Not nothing. Those pioneers who built their houses of logs and made friends with the neighbors who were already here got plowed under, pretty much, their story by the massacring, the rape, pillage, and enslavement that occurred at the hands of the settlers, whether they were French, English, Spanish. They all did it, and it's nothing to be proud of. And I don't mean to be, negative Nelly, but unfortunately, when you are interested in knowing the truth, you uncover some along the way. And so that it has been my lot in life to be a person who uniquely, when it went down, for example, knew that the Chilean coup was a travesty, a tragedy, and it was being done in our name as much as anybody's in Chile in 73. It made me know in 1970 when I woke up in my dorm room and heard on the radio before I even got out of bed that we had invaded Cambodia with no permission from anybody. We were at war in Cambodia. Yeah, in 1969, the October moratorium happened, the Vietnam War moratorium. It was an attempt after, 68 was the convention in Chicago. I was 18. I was working downtown in my father's office, actually, during the day. And what I recall of that week of the convention was disappearing for lunch and never coming back, which was not my normal practice, like 2 or 3 days in a row. One day I saw Eugene McCarthy give a talk, whose button I had worn on my high school blazer the whole year before until Bobby Kennedy got in the race. So yeah, in high school, the anti-war stuff I did, 67, was in a parallel track to the anti-racism stuff I was doing. And of course, one of my first heroes was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As a young, like 12 or 13-year-old, when I heard about the Montgomery bus boycott and saw these dignified marchers being fire hosed, I was never the same. And so by the time King was murdered in April of 68, I was very active in the YCS group in Chicago, which was a biracial integrated group that was thanks to my experience in Mount Greenwood and coming back to the group talking about this cynical ploy that they had tried busing at, of all places, Mount Greenwood School, where the mothers gathered in absolute disgusting array, spat on children, called them names, and used language that they would never have used in front of their own kids. And I remember my mother being approached at our front door with our neighbor with a clipboard to sign up for a time to join them at the school. And I remember my mother controlling herself, but very firmly saying, "I'm not sure where you got the idea I would ever take part in such a thing, but this is not a door you have to knock on with your clipboard." And I'm like, "Yes, Mom, you rock." So I brought that story to my YCS group, and it resulted in us doing a whole study in order to justify having a position on busing. Our chaperones, or the adults who ran YCS, who were all young priests and nuns, said, "Well, you have to do research. You have to know what you're talking about." So we did. We researched busing, and we came up with a statement, and we threw a press conference, and I was my picture was in the New World, and then I couldn't stand where I stood to catch my bus anymore because the people who live there said, "We don't want you on our property." And, as a 17-year-old, I was like, "Fine, I'd rather stand over there. It's much nicer. That's what I'm going to do." So the anti-war stuff followed right behind my awareness of racial inequality and racism that was institutionalized in Chicago like nowhere else, and our South Side unique experience of the overturning neighborhoods. Pointed out to me, rather than what it did to my classmates, which was a whole theory of anti-black stuff, pointed out to me the lack of leadership on the part of the city or the church, all these parishes, to say, stop giving up your most beloved possession, your bungalow. Learn that here's a black person. You two sit down and talk for a while and find out that you're both human beings and that you have the same goals for your kids, and you can share with them how you like your grass cut or not, and see how close you can get. None of that kind of crazy. I know it looks silly, but there were so many things that didn't happen that should have, had we had leadership on this, had we any kind of will to stop the turnover of the neighborhoods.
And the fear.
Yeah, the fear and ignorance. It was all fear and ignorance. So I cannot separate my activism on the war, because it came as a result of already being in a groove of, no, you got to stand up for what you believe. So yeah, we went to that demonstration in '67. In '68, I witnessed the gathering throngs in the convention. Because of the convention, I was beginning to get a read on mass movements and their pros and cons as an observer, one who still would look for the crazies in the group to stay away from them, to steer clear of anybody who had say a football helmet on.
Flag, that's a flag.
A football helmet or a kerchief ready to do this. So I did go out and explore, and I heard Bobby Seale talk in Grant Park, right across from the Hilton, one of those afternoons. Eugene McCarthy.
And Bobby Seale was?
He was the Illinois Secretary of Black Panther Party. But I went home at night. I didn't go into Lincoln Park. I was strictly raised. But there was one night that my parents, thanks to my dad being an employee of the city and also who called his boss Mayor Daley, because of my father's position, he was invited to the Democratic Convention just as an observer. Many people were. And so he and my mother went on the Wednesday night of the convention to the amphitheater to witness the circus that ensued. That was the night that Abraham Ribicoff chastised Daley from the DS, saying the blood is flowing in the streets in Chicago. And that's also the moment where Mayor Daley called him effing Jew from his seat. It was not a fine moment. I was at home in our family room watching footage that I swear some of it I have never seen since. It was live from the streets. It was cops bashing heads with really raised clubs, really coming down. I mean, and I'm talking on people who were less feisty than me, and I could see that, and I'm like, I was a person who was still a few years hence going to take the cop exam. So again, I was holding these policemen to the standard that I was raised thinking that they were, charged to uphold, serving and protecting. And what I saw on the TV that night ended it. Now, I know that black kids had that sense about the police way before me because I knew black kids and they talked about it. And I just I had no reference for the kind of behavior that they were subject to at the hands of the police until they started doing it to white kids who were demonstrating against the war. It's the sad truth, but there it is. So I'm sitting there watching this unfold in 1968 on the TV. My parents come home from the convention, and they had arrived at their seats on which there were placards saying, "We love Mayor Daley," that they were supposed to, hold up at the right moment. They were completely discomfited by what they had seen, disillusioned, upset, disgusted, and then I was sharing with them what I had seen, and of course the coverage continued. And I know at least my mom and I stayed up pretty late that night talking about it. So, that affected me. I mean, I didn't even talk about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, but, we were a generation, they killed a lot of people. They took out JFK. We still don't know if it was because he was about to pull out of Vietnam. But that's one right up there with one of the two or three biggest possibilities. Wow. Can you imagine if we had stopped Vietnam in 64, 65? All the deaths that wouldn't have happened. And when I say deaths, I'm not just talking about the 55,000 lost servicemen and women. I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of innocent Vietnamese. Who do we think pays for that? Where do we think that karma goes? Okay, America? I mean, and that's just what we know about. Most of our peers, your and my peers in this city, do not know that the kind of responsibility our dollars have by attachment to what happened in, say, El Salvador and Guatemala in the 80s. El Salvador, a country is about this big, got our biggest daily dose of foreign aid in a period in the 80s under Reagan. All they did was kill their own people and fill their pockets. Same thing happened in Guatemala.
So did you know anybody personally who died in the war in Vietnam?
Oh, sure. Yeah. One of my first boyfriends, a guy who was from the South Side, who I met up in Delavan.
What was his name?
Larry Dunlop. And Fred Hartman, who lived on our block, died there.
So so in college, did it intensify, or you became more active? I mean...
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
It was very intense. It was because my peers were getting drafted, and that is why there was an anti-war movement, because of the draft, and because everyone was being drafted, not just black and brown people, which is what we have today in the volunteer army. The volunteer army and service allow for people who have no other means to do the advancement thing. That's their path. I think service to the country should be mandatory for every citizen, and I think it should be, something that's done earlier rather than later. The energy of young people is precious and endless, but it shouldn't always be making war. I mean, just imagine if they unleashed the energy of an entire generation, men and women, on, improving infrastructure, planting, cleaning, helping teachers who are completely stretched to the limit.
Yep, and plus the politicians who send our young people into war, if their children were in, serving, they might not be as
couldn't have said it better.
Eager to send them forward.
Well, that is why there were people in Congress who, at that time, who spoke up.
Yeah, can you talk about any of the leaders?
Well, Frank Church. I remember Frank Church and the Church Amendment. I can't remember what it said, but you can look it up. It was an anti-war. It was one of the many attempts by the Doves in the Congress and in the Senate to put a halt on it. It was a democratically run scene from top to bottom, so they would be fighting their own. And there was a ton-load of back and forth and conversation, which brings us to the Vietnam moratorium of October '69. That was a nationwide event, and it was like the well-behaved version of the anti-war stuff.
And this is after '68, after the Chicago riots.
It's a year after that.
Okay.
It's a year. It's also after Days of Rage, no, it's not. Yes, Days of Rage happened in this month in '69, and
what were the Days of Rage?
that was when the underground, well, before they were underground, the extreme left wing went on a tantrum, basically breaking windows downtown and giving us all a bad name because it was pointless. It was Days of Rage. I understood the rage. I was right there with the rage. But, breaking windows downtown to make a statement about it was lost, and I would never have, signed on to do anything like that myself, which is why their numbers were so small. The Vietnam anti-war movement grew to, by the time, I went to Washington. One of the biggest marches on Washington was something like 600,000 people in November. It was cold. People had really had it. I think I also went to Washington in the spring of '70 after the strike. So yeah, the moratorium was a polite way of demonstrating against the war, and the notion was stop business as usual on October 15th to pay attention to and try to bring the war to an end. So at Mundelein we did a really unique, very cool thing. We approached, since we were a women's college, we decided to approach the women in the neighborhood and invite them to Mundelein for the day to learn about foreign policy implications and that domestic program implications of the Vietnam War. We ran a daycare center so that they could bring their kids and be there for the day. It was very hip. It was the coolest thing. And I was actually the coordinator of that. And that night, in fact, I wound up on Channel 11 with a panel of other Chicago students and peace movement or peace group leaders, about 6 or 8 of us, to talk about what the moratorium was. It was like 11 o'clock at night. It was a big, exciting thing. But the Tonkin Gulf incident came into question.
That was the original incident, supposedly, that
Bingo.
we were fired upon.
I actually have a friend who was in a submarine in that Gulf, saw that the ship, whose name I don't remember, at the same time, and there was nothing wrong with that ship. No sign of anybody firing on it. There was that, and then what was the other thing? Oh, we killed Diem. That was when Kennedy was still alive. You know, Ho Chi Minh was the father of his country. Why were we fighting this guy? He was fighting for freedom. He was not fighting to become somebody's communist puppet. We were on the wrong side. And basically, people started learning that. And other people didn't want to hear it or couldn't handle it. It was a big tumble for those of us who took all of that stuff seriously. And we took it seriously enough that we had to say, I don't want my country doing this. And to be called a traitor for doing that was stung. It stung. Some of our best and most forward-thinking and most vanguard anti-war activists were guys who came back and said, I've got to do this. I mean, the most powerful stuff that we could imagine would be, heroes like John Kerry throwing away their medals. And that was seen as a traitorous thing. And I saw it as a very brave thing. So that's different ideas of bravery, courage.
Looking back, what were the best things about being an activist and the worst?
Well, the best thing about being an activist is, standing up for what you believe. Standing up and being counted, I guess. So that, were there anyone to check on? What did you do to help prevent the continued war machine of the U.S.? I can say I did a number of things. I did as much as I could. Maybe I didn't do as much. I mean, I didn't sit down and get arrested. I drew the line there. Although I was always very, very in awe of the Gandhian way, the nonviolent path that King exhibited, incredible bravery of the students who integrated lunch counters in the South and had ketchup poured all over them and taunts and all that sort of thing. To me, that's brave. Standing with a gun in your hand and firing on somebody who's unarmed a block away simply because you're too lazy to run is not brave. The cons is being swept into a mass identity, which those are never real. They don't have to be, but they can turn into troublesome things. To be swept along with, say, the weathermen, who I never even knew until many years later, personally, and I do know them now because they're here in Chicago and leading mostly pretty productive lives. But
for those who don't know about the Weathermen,
that was the underground group that evolved out of the Days of Rage, and it was people committed to violent upheaval
extreme violence.
against the state, and
Bombings.
they never killed anybody per se, but an offshoot, for example, wound up doing a Brinks bank robbery. To me, that was not a political act; that was a robbery in which a guard was killed. They set off bombs in places like the Capitol bathroom and other things after hours, and most people didn't even know about it, know about what they were doing. It was very limited, and they were small, and they mostly hurt themselves. Their own bomb blew up a townhouse in New York, killing a couple people back then. But I mean, that's not my con. My con would be, well, at the time, it was divisive, and so it divided families, it divided friends. So hard to take stands when, it's going to turn people you love away. And then, the thing that happened when I was describing waking up and hearing that we had invaded Cambodia, and I put up the signs, and it was for 2 days hence, the meeting. And what happened between my putting those signs up and the meeting was Kent State, which was also a demonstration against the incursion in Cambodia and Laos, for that matter. And so instead of the regulars, the 30 or so regular political activists that we could rely on each other, I was facing 200 students who were putting their fist in the air saying, strike, strike, strike. Now this was 6 months after the moratorium, which had gone off successfully in October, and basically we wanted to repeat it once a month until the war ended. And so when I asked for permission to do the same thing November 15th, a bunch of the students and the student council, student senate were like, no, that's homecoming weekend. I mean, it's a women's college. We have homecoming. Okay. But they wouldn't let us do the war thing in November because of homecoming. 6 months later, they're all radicalized up. To me, that was a con I couldn't figure out where the conversion process was real and where it was, okay, this is the thing to do. And it sort of became that way thereafter, from that moment on. And we marched from up here at Loyola Mundelein. We had high school students from Senn and Sullivan, marched up to Northwestern, which had declared itself seceded from the Union on the night of the original march to the Illinois Guard Armory to demonstrate against the killings of students by the National Guard. So we all marched up to Northwestern, got into Dyke Stadium. I'm looking at the helicopters above and said to whoever I was sitting with, I said, we're sitting ducks. We're sitting ducks. And so that was, I don't know how else to describe the combination of circus, real genuine fear, and sort of how do we best communicate, our best hopes for this country against the array of attitudes and charges. The generation gap was real. And the hippie versus hard hats argument was out there. All of those stereotypes are hard to break your way through with nuance, but that's what I think we're called to do this lifetime.
Did something happen at Northwestern at Dyke Stadium? I mean, no.
No, a lot of speakers, a lot of rah-rah, probably music, and then we all slowly walked back.
Well, okay, I'm glad you brought up music. So that was some great music, obviously, and films and books came out of or a little past that time.
Yeah.
Were there any groups that you personally or films or
I remember going with my mother and my then boyfriend to see MASH when it first came out.
The film. Robert Altman's.
I think it was in 70.
I think you're right.
And all I was aware of was, sitting next to my mother while very crude language was being used. She soldiered through, though. She liked it. Once she got used to everybody talking at once. 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for was a great release to us all. And so a lot of the Woodstock music.
Did you?
No, I didn't go to Woodstock. I didn't know about it until after it happened. I wouldn't have made it there anyway. But it looked like a good time. And a lot of the music that made it to that stage did echo the themes of the times. And Country Joan and the Fish were a genuinely political band. They did a lot of benefit concerts all over the place. And the small bands that we saw around here, folk music was an occupying, I grew up on classical music, playing the piano and listening to it at home. So folk music became the first other music that I was aware of, and I learned to play the guitar to play it at Mass, the folk masses. And then, so Arlo Guthrie, my first concert, I think, was Arlo Guthrie and Judy Collins. And, but then, I was also, we danced to soul music and R&B, and then the anti-war period included people like the Grateful Dead, Crosby, Stills, Nash. We had a great soundtrack. It's still being played today.
Absolutely.
So I like it. Now, Change Gonna Come. Sam Cooke. Some of those songs still just go right through. Bob Dylan, of course. The political engagement thing, if I can just close with this, we went from marching in the streets and dialoguing in all manner of new kind of ways for the purpose of making a change and having an effect. And we kept going even though it didn't appear like we were having an effect. And I kept going even into taking part in the 72 political campaign. McGovern was the candidate. He didn't have a chance. He won one state. Nixon was reelected. And for a lot of people, that was it. That was where they drew the line on activism. That's where they drew the line on caring. So there are a lot of folks out there in my generation who flipped a switch at that point in their lives. And maybe settled, maybe actually found other kinds of things. But to all of us, I don't think it's ever over. As long as we're breathing, I think we should try and reflect outside what we feel inside. And even when it's difficult, not when it's criminal, I'll stop short of that. But in terms of your belief as to what makes the community better, get out here and prove it. Don't just stay at home whining. It's boring. It's not happiness. And it's much more fun to actually take the challenge, and it has never been a bigger challenge right now than what we've got in front of us to rebuild our schools, our communities, the world, rebuild what we've knocked down, keep the nut balls at bay. Okay, that'll be the keeping the nut balls at bay.
Perfect. All right.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Katy.
Oh, your brother's bound and gagged, and they've chained him to a chair. Won't you please come to Chicago just to sing? In a land that's known as freedom, how can such a thing be fair? Won't you please come to Chicago for the help that we can bring? We can change the world, rearrange the world is dying to get better. Politicians, sit yourselves down, there's nothing for you here. Won't you please come to Chicago for a ride? Don't ask Jack to help you, 'cause he'll turn the other ear. Won't you please come to Chicago, or else join the other side? We can change the world, rearrange the world is dying. If you believe in justice, if you believe in freedom, let a man live his own life. Rules and regulations, who needs them? Throw 'em at the door, oh yeah. Somehow people must be free. I hope the day comes soon. Won't you please come to Chicago and show your face? From the bottom of the ocean to the mountains of the moon. Won't you please come to Chicago? No one else can take your place.